So recently I created my second private podcast called Dear Biz Bestie. This one is free and for everyone on my email list. So while I was setting it up, I kept track of how I exactly did it step by step so that I could turn it into a video for those of you that want to do the same for yourselves or for your clients. So whether you're starting a private podcast for your business, for your audience, clients, or customers, or to grow your email list, or even just to keep a little audio diary for yourself, hey, you are in the right place. Hey, my name is Dea, freelancer, digital business manager, most recently an entrepreneur, and as always, you can find sections on the playboard below if you want to skip to a certain part of the video. Your time is precious, so take what you need, and if you want to watch this on 2x, I won't be offended at all. Okay, let's dive straight into the video. So why create a private podcast, and what's the difference between a paid and a free private podcast? So broadly speaking, there are two types of private podcasts. The first is the paid kind, which basically just means that not everyone can access it. They have to spend some money in your business to somehow get access to it, like buying a course or training from you or getting coaching from you or something like that. The great things about private podcasts for paid purposes include things like you can limit access to specific people, so you can give them a private subscribe link, so not just everybody can find it in the podcast app. You can give it to course students or mastermind or coaching students to kind of give them an additional aid with your services. You can offer it as another way essentially to consume your training or content instead of having to watch videos or to read text, which may be more convenient for some because sometimes audio is more convenient depending on what we do in our day-to-day routines. Like you can listen to a podcast in a car versus watching a video, if that makes sense. So other than Dear Biz Bestie, my new private podcast, DBB if you will, I actually have another private podcast, my first one, and it's called Pep Talks. I released that a few months ago. Pep Talks is only available to students in my paid course DBM Bootcamp, so that's what I mean by like a paid podcast. They don't pay for the podcast, but they pay for the course and get the podcast. So the episodes within it talk through like hurdles that course students may have as they dive into the journey of working online as a digital business manager, plus has a few like fun episodes recorded by alumni of the bootcamp sharing their top tips. I wanted to create it because I thought it would be a useful resource for those that are just getting started and need a little bit of motivation to like push through some of the trickier parts where, you know, your mind voices are really loud and they're telling you like, you can't do this and who are you to do this and everything. I wanted to give them something to combat those voices essentially and come out of it being like, you know what, there are people who believe I can do this and know I can do it. So that's essentially an example of a paid podcast, if you will. The second type is a free podcast. So the great things here is you can get an opt-in and build your email list through the private podcast. There's exclusivity, right? They have to jump through kind of like hoops to opt in. It may also feel more intimate for that person, feeling like they're getting private access to you. And it might also feel more intimate for the recorder of the podcast because it feels like not everyone can listen to it. So Dear Biz Bestie, my second private podcast, is going to be my free private podcast available essentially to anyone that wants to join my email list and get access to it. So the goal of Dear Biz Bestie, my new podcast, before we dive into the step-by-step, the goal for me was really to create intimacy and create connection with the people in my audience. I feel like email can really only go so far. So I'm not really creating the podcast for growth or discoverability, which is why like that factored a lot into my decision to create a private podcast instead of a public podcast. So that's the goal, is to create that intimacy and feel like I'm talking to my biz bestie. So tech-wise, I'll primarily be using Hello Audio for this. This video is not sponsored. I wish. But I am including an affiliate link below. If you do want to check them out, then you can. But obviously you can just type the name into Google as well and find it there. All right, let's dive into the step-by-step. So step one is to gauge interest and demand for your private podcast. If you're starting a private podcast for yourself to journal verbally, then you can skip this step, obviously. For my own podcast, I was thinking more from a business perspective of whether this was something my audience actually wanted or would enjoy, or if, they would actually be open to listening to it. Plus, I think this is a good way to drum a pipe ahead of a podcast as well. So essentially what I did was I asked if people would be interested in one of my emails to my email list, and I polled on my IG story if people would be interested, which I would recommend to anybody that's considering it. 77 people responded to my email saying yes, and about 90 people on Instagram said they'd be interested. Those were the results. So it seemed like it could potentially be something I should explore. Obviously, whether they actually listen is another story, but your audience will really always be the best people to ask if you are considering a potential big time or money investment for your business. Also, you can poll people on what they would like you to talk about on the podcast. Like, what questions do they have? What are they struggling with? What kind of tips or strategies, what kind of like types of strategies would they like to learn about? So that's always a really good option as well. Step 2 is to come up with your goal for the podcast as well as an angle for the podcast, and have in mind who that target person listening, your target listener is, and potentially also like a theme around your podcast to keep it interesting and maybe, be a little bit more outside of the box and unique with your target. So the first question to ask yourself is, what is the goal of this podcast? What is the point of creating it? So I shared my goal a little bit earlier, but have a think about what that goal is, because you want to interlace that into every episode. Second question, do you have a unique angle or niche? What's the vibe of the podcast that you're kind of going for? So my vibe for my podcast was, I really wanted it to be like I was leaving voice messages for my biz bestie. I actually do have a business best friend, and her and I chat every single week, and every single chat is like us sharing tips and strategies and giving each other encouragement and like dealing with the mindset stuff and giving each other updates on what's going on. So I wanted my podcast to feel like that, like informal, friendly. It's also important for me not to waste other people's time, so I cap it. Like, I try to aim for 5 minutes per episode because I wanted it to be short and ideally binge worthy for people and not feel like they have to sit through an entire thing. The third question is, who is the ideal person sitting on the other end listening? What are they like? What are they struggling with? What do they need to hear where they are currently at? And the fourth question to ask yourself is, what are your core content pillars? What are you going to talk about? Are there any themes there? What won't you talk about? So for me, for example, I talk about personal business, like behind the scenes. I totally just like missed my hand. Personal business behind the scenes of my business, what's going on. I talk about my mindset struggles, which there are abundant. And I talk about general like strategies and tips I've picked up along the way that I want to just share, which I think made a difference in me succeeding versus maybe stumbling more. So those are kind of my main pillars that I kind of go through in my podcast. Pillars are actually super useful, not just for your audience to kind of get a clear picture of your niche, but it's also really good for you because it's a great way to brainstorm topics. So it's not just like everything under the sun is like up for grabs as potentially a podcast topic, but like, okay, here are my 3 categories. What can I think of within those categories, if that makes sense? Step 3 is to come up with the name of the podcast. Now, the big caveat here is the name doesn't matter that much. It should ideally be clear and simple to understand. Nothing too like cutesy or confusing, because confused people do not take action. So we want to make things super clear and easy for them to understand. And don't get stuck on this step. Just proceed, right? Dear Biz Bestie is not the best title in the world, but it doesn't matter. It's about what's in the podcast. Step 4 is your podcast cover art. I use Canva for this. They have great templates. It's what I recommend to you. It's like a square graphic. Don't worry about this too much since it is a private podcast. Nobody will really see the podcast cover art until they subscribe anyway, unless you make some mock-ups or something. So just whip up something fast. You can use tons of templates. Like Canva is such an MVP because they have tons of podcast templates, lots of really nice ones as well. Just put your title of your podcast on there, and you can like do a short little tagline. Like I have a short little tagline on my cover art as well, and then a picture of you or some sort of animation or graphic. Step 5 is optional, which is to get a podcast intro. If you want one, you can easily hire someone on Fiverr or Upwork to do one. I personally don't have one because I don't really think it's necessary for the vibe I'm going for, because it is an informal podcast, so I didn't feel like I needed to have like a lot of production value behind it. But yeah, you can easily find someone on Fiverr and Upwork, and that's where I found people for clients as well to get their podcast intro. Step 6 is to pre-plan your content. I try to aim for at least 1 to 2 months worth of content ahead of time. So think through what is your schedule. Make sure you do something realistic for your workload. I honestly, in the beginning, this is like so ridiculous. I was like, I'm going to make this a daily podcast and I'm going to do this every single day. And ironically, my business best friend, Georgie, she was like, Dea, are you sure you want to do daily episodes? Like that sounds like a lot of stress. Like why not just do episodes as regularly as you can for your schedule? And if they are daily, great, but you don't kind of hold yourself to that standard. So I'm really glad she told me that, because immediately like this huge weight was off my shoulders. So my best advice is to aim for a little bit lower than what you think you can realistically achieve, so that it never feels overwhelming and stressful and like, oh my gosh, I have to record 16 episodes this week to like catch up or something. And if you want me to make a full video on my content calendar, let me know below as well, and I can definitely share that. But I would definitely recommend having at least a handful of episodes ready before releasing the podcast, and having them already live in your podcast, just so when people subscribe, they already have a few things to listen to and not just like one intro episode, which is not that enticing for your audience. And I would also make sure to decide if you want to fully script each episode out, outline your main points from bullet points, or just give yourself a title and main talking point for each episode. Those are kind of your three options when it comes to planning your like podcast content. It's like, do I want a full script? Do I just want bullet points? Or do I want to have just like one thing and then I can just talk about that thing? So as an example for Dear Biz Bestie, mine is just a big list of ideas in Notion. Like I don't even have outlines for the most part. Because they're 5-minute episodes, I really only want to make 1 point per episode. So I just hit record without much prepared. I also want them to be relatively informal and unscripted. You know, like I don't script out my conversations with Georgie before our chats. So that's kind of just in line with the vibe that I wanted to go for. Step 7 is to set up your Hello Audio account. So when I first started this, I started with the trial to give myself a go before I fully committed. Again, this isn't a sponsored video, but I have an affiliate link below. If you want to use it, you don't have to. You can also just go to their website. But yeah, you'll just want to set that up, load in your cover art, put in the name of your podcast. It's super easy. It took me less than 10 minutes. Step 8 is to gather your recording equipment. So here's a disclaimer. I am not an audio technician or an expert. I don't even know if that's what they're called by any means. And I'm sure there are a million things here you can do to make your sound studio quality, and there are much more qualified people on YouTube to talk about that. I'm not super fussed with that because again, my podcast is meant to be really informal, and I find that the more steps I create for myself, the less likely I will do it. So this is kind of my like quick and dirty, easy start guide, if you will. So the first thing that you're gonna need is some sort of a microphone to capture sound for your episode. So cover your ears, podcast specialists. Okay, those of you who aren't specialists, honestly, I think even just Apple's microphone is okay if you're just getting started. I have the Auna Mic 900B now, but when I got started first, I just used my Apple earphones. Just make sure that the quality is good and always test before you record a full episode. The other tool you will definitely need is some sort of recorder and editor. Audio recorder, audio editor. I use Audacity, which is completely free and you can download it online. That's where I record my episodes and where I edit my episodes too, which I'll talk about in a second. Step 9, it's time to record your episodes. So here's your little checklist. Make sure you have your notes pulled up, whether that's a script or an outline. Open up Audacity, make sure it's pulling audio from the right microphone. I have made this mistake too many times. Make sure it's pulling from the right microphone. Test your recording, so like do a little test 5 seconds thing. Make sure your background is as quiet as possible. If there is a lot of echo, you can build yourself into like a little fort to absorb some of the sound with like pillows and everything. There are lots of guides online on how to do that. And make sure you don't actually rub up against your microphone. It's a little bit of distance away from you. It's not directly in front of your lips either. And of course, like I always say, test before recording. That is my biggest tip before you start recording, and then begin talking. So step 10 is to edit. So if you're a professional podcast editor, like please go. You're only hurting yourself staying here. So I only really do 2 quick edits because again, I want to make this process like super fast and easy for myself. I only do like 1 background noise removal in Audacity where I just like remove the little bits of like noise, like Max typing super loud on his keyboard, and I normalize the audio, and then I export it as an MP3, and it's done, the episode. So step 11 is to upload. I open up Hello Audio, I toss in the MP3 file. I'm like, here you go. And I come up with the podcast name and I either publish it right away or I schedule it out. I normally record in batches, so I'll do like 5 episodes at once. So I'll schedule some of them out so they don't all publish on the same day. And then step 12, where this is going, is to set up your opt-in page to the private podcast. If you're doing a private podcast as part of your course or training, just give students the link via lesson or send it to them via email when they join. If you're doing a free private podcast like Dear Biz Bestie, you'll need a place for people to opt into the private podcast. So I set up my opt-in pages, all my opt-in pages via Elementor and WordPress because that's what my site uses, but you can use whatever email management software. Most of them have landing pages, so you can just set that up. My opt-in form is from Thrive Leads and it's hooked up to my ActiveCampaign, which is my email software, to deliver this email when someone opts in, and that includes the link to subscribe to the podcast. So that's how the tech magic works. Step 13, we're almost there, is to test on your device. So click that link on your mobile and just make sure that the subscribed link to the podcast actually opens up properly and you can listen to your episode. And that's it. That's the whole thing. After that, you'll just want to promote it, send out a link to the people who said they were interested, track your analytics, and stay consistent with it. Depending on your podcast goals, that will kind of influence your strategy. So make sure to always refer back to why you started a podcast in the first place and make sure that you're always aligning your decisions and tasks and metrics to that goal that originally spurred the idea. So I hope that was helpful in helping you get going with yours or a client's private podcast. If you want to use Hello Audio, my special link is below. And if you want to subscribe to my private podcast, Dear Biz Bestie, you know where to find it. Point. Me verbally saying point as I point. And I'll see you in the next video. All right, bye.